Good morning.
Good morning. Y'all dry?
All dry. There's something about extremes, isn't there? Tallest, deepest, coldest, furthest. If it's got a superlative attached, somebody's probably already booked a ticket, or at least they've printed a t-shirt. Now we humans have always had a thing for the ends of the earth. The North Pole, the South Pole, the mystical places where compasses spin and penguins look unimpressed. Flags have been planted, frostbite earned, and people have proudly stood on the top of the world only to discover that it doesn't have Wi-Fi. But here's the thing, this obsession with the edges, it's not just about where we go, it's about how we think. We're trained to aim for the extremes, to dream of Everest, not the valley, to dive into the Mariana Trench, not to wade through the shallows. We talk about polar opposites like they're the only options. North or south, black or white, right or wrong. And there's a romance to the edge. It feels brave, bold, a little dangerous. And let's be honest, it's a lot more interesting to talk about at dinner parties than, say, the moderately temperate and emotionally balanced. But what if we're missing something? What if the most fascinating parts of our world or our lives are not at the edges at all? What if they're somewhere in the middle? Today I want to take you on a different kind of journey. Not just from pole to pole, but to a whole other kind of pole. The forgotten, the strange, the gloriously inconvenient places that exist far from the maps that we're taught at school. And in doing so, I want to challenge the idea that meaning only lives at the extremes. Because while everybody's busy planting their flag over at the edge, there is a whole world of nuance, depth, and richness in between. I'm not here to say don't chase adventure. By all means, climb the mountain, cross the ice shelf, swim with the penguins. But maybe, just maybe, there's value in stopping to look around halfway there, in exploring the center, not just the sides. Because the center, that mysterious, ordinary, complicated middle, is where life actually happens. If we can learn to love the middle, we might just discover we've been standing in something extraordinary all along. So buckle up and let's head to the poles. But perhaps not the ones you were expecting. Not all poles are icy. Not all poles have penguins or polar bears. And not all poles are where we think they are. Some are baking hot. Some are wet. There are some so remote that the nearest human is actually orbiting the planet. But they're poles all the same. Extremes, ends, limits. And like all extremes, they've got something to teach us. Let's begin at the top. Not geographically, but vertically. And we all know this one. Everest. 8,848.86 meters above sea level. This is the roof of the world. People train for years. They remortgage their homes. They risk their lives to reach this summit. And for good reason. It's majestic, sacred, it's terrifying. In Tibetan, it's called Chomolungma, which means goddess mother of the world. In Nepalese, Sagarmatha, forehead of the sky. Either way, it's not the kind of mountain you pop up on a weekend stroll. And for decades, it was a riddle wrapped in rock and ice. And in the early 20th century, mountaineers approached it like it was a dragon guarding the edge of the earth. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine tried in 1924 and disappeared into the clouds, their fate unknown. When Mallory was once asked why he had wanted to climb it, he famously replied, "Because it's there." Possibly the most British reason ever given for nearly dying. Then, in 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay did it. The first confirmed humans to stand on the summit. It was the coronation year for Queen Elizabeth II, and this became the crown jewel. Hillary, a New Zealander beekeeper, and Norgay, a Sherpa from Nepal, reached the top together. And they didn't plant a flag. They just took a few photos, buried some sweets, and quietly made their way down before their oxygen tank ran out. It was epic. It was raw, and for decades, it remained a rare triumph. But fast forward to today, and Everest has changed. There's a base camp bakery now. You can get wood-fired pizza at 5,300 meters. And there is even Wi-Fi when the clouds are feeling cooperative. Helicopters drop off supplies, and for the right price, they'll even drop you too. And in peak season, there are traffic jams on the Hillary step. Literally, queues of climbers waiting to take their turn to the summit like it's the world's most dangerous amusement park ride. Everest has become oddly accessible, commercialized even. It's not just a mountain anymore, it's a business. Tour operators, oxygen logistics, drone photography packages, Instagram stories with captions like "living my truth" while clutching an oxygen mask. And yet the magic remains. Because no matter how many selfies are taken, no matter how many pizzerias pop up at base camp, Everest is still Everest. It still commands awe, it still kills people. It still humbles those who underestimate it. You can't shortcut the summit. And anyone who stood up there will tell you, between the gasping breaths and those frozen eyelashes, that it changes something in you. Everest is still a pole of human ambition, a place people go not just to climb a mountain, but to measure themselves against something bigger than ego, than muscle and hype. But now let's flip things around. If Everest is the top of the world, Challenger Deep is the bottom, the absolute floor of the planet, a point so deep in the ocean that if you dropped Mount Everest into it, the summit would still be over a mile underwater. It lies within the Mariana Trench, which is in the Western Pacific. It's nearly 11 kilometers down. That's 36,000 feet. The depth here is so immense, it's almost meaningless in our everyday scale. It's about as far from the world as you can get without leaving the planet. To go there is not a swim. It's not even a dive. It's a descent. A slow, creaking surrender into a place where sunlight has never once been. Where it is cold, it's near freezing. Where it's silent except for that groaning pressure. And speaking of pressure, down there, it's over 1,000 times greater than at sea level. That's like having 50 jumbo jets sitting on your chest, which is a lot to carry, even on a good day. And yet, remarkably, life exists there. Strange, alien-looking life. Gelatinous blobs that pulse with their own glow. Shrimps with transparent shells. Microbes living off the chemicals that seep out of hydrothermal vents. They're not just clinging to existence. These things are thriving in an environment that can flatten a submarine like a soda can. Now here's where it gets interesting. Fewer people have been to Challenger Deep than have walked on the moon. You could fit the entire visitor list in a minibus and still have room for snacks. It is that rare. One of the most famous descents was by James Cameron. Yes, that James Cameron, the director of Titanic, Avatar, and other multi-million-dollar trips into fictional oceans. But in 2012, he took a very real one. He piloted a custom-built submersible called Deep Sea Challenger, and he dove solo to the bottom. And he described it as a kind of dreamlike state, a kind of trance. The journey took over 2 hours down. He spent just 70 minutes on the seafloor, And then, like a reverse rocket launch, he rose back up to the surface in less than half an hour. From near silence to sunshine in 26 minutes. He later said he wanted to see the most alien world on Earth. And he did. But he wasn't the first one to go there. That happened in 1960, over half a century earlier. Two men you've maybe never heard of. Don Walsh, a US Navy lieutenant, and Jacques Piccard, who was a Swiss oceanographer. And their submersible, the Trieste, looked like a steel bathtub strapped to a balloon. And it was barely tested. It creaked, and at one point the outer window cracked under the pressure. They stayed for only 20 minutes before returning to the surface. But they made it with 1960s tech, without GPS, without the internet to tell anyone about it. So why don't we remember their names like we remember Armstrong and Aldrin or Edmund Hillary? Because it wasn't the moon. It wasn't the peak of Everest. It was down, not up. Quiet, not glorious. Murky, not sparkly. We glorify height. It's no coincidence that the world's great cathedrals force your gaze up. It's inspiring. It's the physical architectural embodiment of a higher presence. But make no mistake, Challenger Deep is a pole. Not the kind with flags and footprints, but it's a boundary. It's a test. A place that reminds us how much of our planet is still unknown, still unseen. It's so easy to forget the depths. We look up at Everest in awe. We look down into the trench and think, it's just water. But it's not just water. It's the last great unknown frontier on our planet, and it lies beneath our feet. Now for our third pole that's not a pole-to-pole pole. Let's talk about loneliness. Not the I forgot my phone at home kind, not even the I'm the only one in a cinema kind. I mean proper planetary scale isolation. And let me introduce you to Point Nemo, the most remote place on Earth. Remote as in literally further away from humanity than the astronauts circling above in space. Technically speaking, Point Nemo is the oceanic pole of inaccessibility. It sits deep in the South Pacific Ocean, roughly equidistant from three tiny uninhabited specks of land, Ducie Island, Motunui, and Maha Island. But don't worry, you're not expected to have really heard of them. Even the birds forget to stop there. The coordinates of Point Nemo are approximately 48 degrees, 52.6 minutes south, and 123 degrees, 23.6 minutes west. And there is nothing. No island, no coral atoll, no rock. Just 2,688 kilometers of uninterrupted ocean in every direction. The closest land is over 1,600 miles away. If you tried to row there, you'd run out of hope before you ran out of water. And here's where it gets stranger. At most times, the nearest people to Point Nemo are not on Earth at all. They are the astronauts on board the International Space Station, orbiting 400 kilometers above. So if something goes wrong, your best chance of rescue is from someone hurtling through space 17,500 miles an hour. It's the furthest point from any landmass on the planet. A geographic shrug, a cartographer's afterthought. A few people have visited, very few. No one's ever lived there. No one probably ever will. Even sailing ships avoid it. The South Pacific Gaia, which is a huge rotating current, makes sure that most life skips past. The water is so nutrient poor that even algae struggles to grow here. It's like the desert of the sea. But oddly enough, we do use it for one specific purpose: crashing spaceships. Since the 1970s, Point Nemo has become Earth's unofficial spacecraft cemetery. When satellites or space stations or other orbiting junk needs to be deorbited safely, engineers often target Point Nemo. Why? Because it's the safest place on Earth to drop a 100-ton flaming heat of twisted metal. There's no one around to care. Over 260 spacecraft has been directed to their watery graves here, including Russia's Mir space station. And one day, the International Space Station will end up here too. Which means that if you were to dive beneath the surface of Point Nemo, you wouldn't find fish. You'd find ghosts of human ambition rusting quietly on the seafloor. And it's kind of poetic. The most unreachable place on Earth, littered with the remains of things we once sent to the stars. But unlike Everest, no one queues to visit. Unlike Challenger Deep, there's no pressure to explore it. Point Nemo is a pole in the truest sense. It's a conceptual extreme, a place we define more by absence than by presence. And maybe that's its quiet magic. Sometimes poles aren't places to conquer, they're places to acknowledge. So why are we drawn to the edges of the Earth? Why are we obsessed with reaching the most, the highest, the lowest, the hottest, the coldest, the furthest from anything point? Why do we throw ourselves at Everest? Why plunge into the trench or stare into the void or orbit the middle of the sea like it's some sort of sacred pilgrimage? Part of it, I think, is the thrill of it all, the clarity of the extreme. It's simple. There's a number, a target, a record to break. Extremes make the world feel measurable. They give us goals that are easy to define, even if they're hard to reach. And we love stories with clear goals. We're raised on the romance of extremes. The explorer pushing past where the map ends, the athlete going faster than anybody ever has, the visionary reaching deeper or climbing higher, surviving colder. These are the stories we tell. These are the ones that we share. The middle, on the other hand, it doesn't really make the headlines. There's no medal for reasonably balanced daily routine. There's no statue for good listener with nuanced opinions. You don't get famous for almost climbing Everest, but turning around because the weather looked iffy. Maybe you should. Because here's the thing. Our hunger for extremes, while inspiring, can also be exhausting. Not just physically, but existentially. We start to believe that only the extreme matters. That unless we're the first, the best, the furthest, the most, we haven't done enough. That if we're not standing on the summit or free diving to mythic depths or sitting in some sort of bamboo hut in a remote valley finding ourselves, that we're wasting our time. But that's not true. And deep down we know it. Even Edmund Hillary, who did summit Everest, later said, it's not the mountain we conquer, it's ourselves. That's the real summit. And you can reach it in places with no altitude at all. Sometimes the most profound view doesn't come from standing on the edge, it comes from looking inside. And I think we need that balance. Yes, chase the mountain. Yes, marvel at the trench. But don't forget the quiet, the ordinary, the complex middle. Because not everything worth doing needs a flag at the end of it. Extremes can reveal us, but the middle is where we're formed. It's where values are tested. It's where real growth happens, where nuance lives and community and compromise. And maybe, just maybe, the best stories aren't the ones where someone goes the furthest. Maybe they're the ones where someone stops, takes a breath, and decides not to go further at all. Now, this pole-to-pole voyage sounds exciting because it reaches the edges of the world, the poles. And the poles we've looked at this morning also sound intriguing or exciting. There's definitely something about them. But now I want to bring you somewhere different. It's not a summit, it's not a trench, it is not a pole. In fact, it's somewhere where we're spending a lot more of our time in this pole-to-pole voyage. The middle. Now, some people think that the middle sounds boring. It's not dramatic, it doesn't set records, it doesn't make headlines, but I disagree. Let's look at this geographically. The equator, that invisible belt across the planet's belly, doesn't get that much press, but it is where life explodes. Rainforests, biodiversity, hotspots, ecosystems layered like wedding cakes. The Amazon, the Congo, Borneo, these aren't just lifeless in-betweens. They are teeming, moist, chaotic, messy, not extreme by temperature or elevation, but utterly alive. You move a little north or a little south, and then you find yourselves in the temperate zones. Not the hottest, not the coldest, but they're where most people live, where agriculture took root, where civilizations sprouted up, traded, built, rebuilt, made mistakes, wrote poetry, tried again. The middle isn't empty. It's where humanity figured out how to do life. And it's the same with ideas. Extremes are loud. They have slogans. They yell across the table. But in the middle, somewhere between always and never, that's where the nuance lives. Where people say things like, it's complicated, or let's think about it, or maybe both sides have a point. It's not quite as satisfying as a headline, but it's much more useful when you're trying to build a world together. And the middle doesn't just exist out there in the world. It exists within us too. Think about it. Most of our lives happens between milestones, between birthdays, or promotions, or retirements, or breakthroughs. The dishes, the weekly shop, the long Tuesday in February where nothing special happened, but still everything matters. That's the middle. That's the truth of life. That's where we're taught to celebrate the highs, to fear the lows, but that day to day, that unremarkable, unastonishing middle, that's where love happens. That's where trust is built. That's where character is shaped. That's where you learn to show up, even when no one's handing out a medal. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't chase bold goals or strive for change or go big occasionally. But if all we do is chase the extreme, we risk missing the extraordinary in the ordinary. Like that small town you only stopped in for petrol but ended up staying for lunch, and then you heard a story from a stranger that stayed with you for years. Or that conversation that you didn't expect to matter that ended up changing your direction. Or a quiet moment, just you, a cup of coffee, and the knowledge that today, for once, was enough. The middle isn't a failure to reach the edge. It's a destination in its own right. In fact, some cultures even celebrate the middle. In Buddhism, there's a concept of the middle way, a path of moderation, avoiding the extremes of self-indulgence or self-denial. It's not as exciting as an ice axe or a submarine, maybe, but it's deeply wise. Balance isn't boring, it's brave. It takes more courage to stay steady than to lurch from one extreme to another. So next time someone tells you to go to the ends of the earth, maybe ask them what they're doing with the part in between. Because the middle, that's where life lives. I want to share with you one final thought about poles, those classic ends of the earth. Because there's something odd about the poles. Something that doesn't make sense until you're standing right on one. At the North Pole, there is only one direction you can go. South. Every step away from it, in any direction at all, is technically correct. Pick a path and you are right, which sounds great, until you realize that if every direction is right, none of them really is. You can walk in circles and still be going south. The same is true at the South Pole, except obviously in reverse. From there, every direction is north, but if you take a left, take a right, spin in place, it is still a north. It's disorienting, but it's also kind of familiar, because that's what happens when we operate from extremes. From the outer edges of certainty, every decision we make feels justified. Everything becomes black or white. We can convince ourselves that we're going the right way just because we're moving. But direction without context isn't clarity, it's just motion. Just because you're not wrong doesn't mean you're right. And that's the danger of living at the poles. whether they're geographic or ideological, emotional, professional. You get so far out to one end, so locked into your perspective, that any movement feels like progress. But you might just be walking in circles, thinking you're discovering something when really you're just retracing your own footsteps. The center, the middle, offers something else. It's harder, it's messier, it's full of conflicting directions and decisions. But it's also where you start to navigate, not just move. Where you're not spinning around a single point, but you're actually making choices that lead somewhere. We think of the poles as destinations, but really, they're just coordinates. The real journey, the part that matters, begins when you leave the pole behind and you start figuring out where you actually want to go. So as you leave this talk, whether you're off to climb a mountain or book your next cruise to Antarctica or just go back to your room for a good read, here's a thought I want to leave you with. Extremes are exciting, but they're not always enlightening. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to go further. It's to stop, to think, to step back from the edge, and to ask, where am I really? Because life isn't lived at the ends. It's lived in between. And in the middle, that's where your compass really starts working. Thank you.